15 seconds just elapsed. That's the amount of time it takes an Israeli, once he or she hears the Tzeva Adom, the red alert, the siren, alerting everyone that an incoming rocket is on its way, to find shelter. In 2014, I found myself walking home back to my apartment from the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and hearing that siren. I was on Marcus Street, just across from the Jerusalem Theater. I had nowhere to go. And so I and the friend who was with me took shelter behind a tree. And we watched as an Iron Dome missile intercepted a Hamas rocket just above our heads. It was one of the most frightening experiences that I have had. Throughout my time thereafter, I would be awakened early at night, early in the morning, and had to run down to the shelter in my apartment building because yet another rocket was on its way from the Gaza Strip. And then there was the moment I was walking to Hartman and the alarm went off. I saw a man walking on the sidewalk with his son, and we both started to run toward each other. We were outside of the Hartman campus, and I urged him to follow me. We entered the gate, we ran down to the Beit Midrash, and we made our way down to the shelter in its basement, filled with people from the Hartman Institute. And we heard the intercepts above us. I was actually walking to Hartman to meet with my teacher and friend, Dr. Tal Becker, who's a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute, to talk about his upcoming visit to my former congregation for a scholar in residence weekend. And I remember how upset and frightened I was for Tal because he wasn't in the shelter with me, and I wondered what had happened to him. Fortunately, when we all emerged, I found Tal, and we sat down, we caught our breath, and the first thing he did was to call home to make sure that his young children were safe. One of those rockets landed in their neighborhood. I share this with you because it has been a very, very trying week for me personally, and I'm sure for many of you. All these memories come back as I hear about my friends, many of them living in Tel Aviv, who have spent hours in the shelters in their homes or in their buildings in the middle of the night, waiting for the barrage of rockets to end. Fortunately, none of them have been hurt or injured. None of their family have been killed. But there have been deaths caused by indiscriminately fired rockets from the Gaza Strip. I am not one who subscribes to the notion that whatever Israel does is unimpeachable and not worthy of critique or criticism. I'm also not of the school of thought that everything Israel does is wrong, and Israel is always the first to be blamed. I find myself among the wide and very deep swath of the Jewish community in North America and throughout the world who understands that the Middle East is a very complicated and also very dangerous place, and that there are decisions that the Israeli government makes that oftentimes are not the right decisions, are oftentimes mistakes, no different from any other Western-style liberal democracy. And yet, like many Israelis across the political spectrum, there is an understanding that there is never a valid excuse for engaging in terrorism. Not the legal dispute centered on Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, where there is a case pending before the Israeli Supreme Court about the legality of the eviction of 6 Palestinian families in that neighborhood. Someone I know who I trust implicitly, who has taught me to look at every issue through a Jewish moral lens, who is self-identified as center-left politically, and who is a very high-ranking Israeli negotiator, has said to me and to other rabbinic colleagues that he has very little sympathy for the claims in Sheikh Jarrah about the evictions of those families, that those who claim ownership of those 6 homes have very, very strong legal claims. They go back to the late 1800s, and that it is highly appropriate for the Supreme Court to hear the case. And that dispute should not give credence to the notion that firing rockets at civilians is a way to resolve that issue. The Israeli police didn't necessarily handle the situation on the Temple Mount the way that many of us would have liked. And there are many other things that the Israeli government has done and will probably do in the future that we would question. But none of it would reach the level that would in any way give validity to seeking to harm and kill innocent Israeli civilians. My teacher and the leader of the institute that I formerly worked for, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Hartman, said the following this week about how he feels about what's going on in Israel and the conflict. Israel is completely at the whim of a terrorist organization which can decide for itself its own interest to terrorize a whole country. We have a clever, clever enemy. We know they manipulated this moment to lay claim to the leadership of the Palestinian people, that they couldn't achieve in an election because the election was canceled one more time. So it's in their interests, and we're constantly in danger. My teacher, Dr. Rabbi Hartman, is very, very left of center, and yet he understands how nuanced and complex this situation is, and how wrong and utterly indefensible it is for Hamas to fire over 1,000 missiles at Israel, indiscriminately endangering the lives not only of Jewish Israelis, but of Arab Israelis, Druze Israelis, Samaritan Israelis, any citizen of the state of Israel. We all know what the United States would do if Syria or Lebanon or Iran or the Gaza Strip were on our north or southern border and attacked us. We all know what would happen. And we all know what would happen if Hamas stopped firing missiles at Israel. And we all know what would happen if Israel didn't continue to defend its citizens, a right that every single nation in the world has, not just a right, but an obligation. We all know what would happen if Israel didn't take action to protect its citizens. I grieve for all who have died, specifically for Israeli citizens who have died, for innocent Palestinian citizens in the Gaza Strip who have died, They're all the victims of the proximate cause. The action that Hamas took to fire 1, 2, 3, 100, 500, and now over 1,000 rockets. The blame for the loss of life lies at their feet. This is an enemy that benefits from asymmetrical warfare. It embeds itself among a dense civilian population. It headquarters itself in civilian buildings. It fires its rockets from civilian buildings. And unlike the Israeli government and the IDF, which actually calls the residents in buildings in Gaza before they launch a strike, asking those residents, warning them to leave, Hamas fires its missiles and gives no warning. Israelis have just those 15 seconds to find shelter. What gravely troubles me is the violence that has broken out on the streets of Israeli towns and cities, those known especially for their coexistence between Jewish Israelis and Arab Palestinian Israelis. We were reaching a point, or Israelis were, where there was a sincere effort to try to bridge the gap between these two communities. More and more Israelis were learning Arabic in their schools. More and more Israeli Arabs were trying to perfect their Hebrew. More and more Israeli Arabs were serving Israel in the IDF. And we were actually reaching the point where an Israeli Arab party was negotiating to enter an Israeli government, or a possible Israeli government. And now, unfortunately, that progress has been shattered by the mob violence that has taken place on both sides, Jewish and Arab. It is awful and horrible, and it should be condemned. Israelis, regardless of their ethnic or religious identity or status, should share equality, be treated fairly under the law, and be free of fear of having other citizens harm them or take their lives. I am heartened by the fact that in some towns and cities, Arab and Jewish Israelis have come together, exchanged flowers, hugged now that the country's reached herd immunity, sung together in Arabic and in Hebrew. I hope and pray that their efforts will prevail over the violence that has taken place between these two communities. I hope and pray that the violence will end, the missiles will end, that young and old alike, innocent people will be able to sleep soundly at night and be able to move on and hopefully live in peace. Let us all pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Let us all pray for a peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Let us all pray for peace between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab Palestinians. And most especially, let's do the important work we need to do in our own community. Israel used to be the one unifying factor in North American Jewish life, and it is now the third rail. It is now the one issue that divides us the most. Let's figure a way out to talk and to discuss and converse and argue respectfully about Israel, about the Middle East, and the efforts to make peace. We have enough enemies in this world. We don't need them among ourselves. I want to wish all of you Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, and may this Shabbat and this holiday of Shavuot bring all of us a modicum of peace.